program coordinator for the MSc in literacy with a dyslexia endorsement. I know many with us today are part of our program. If you're not, just to share with you, we are the only accredited institution in the state of Arkansas from the International Dyslexia Association, and also one of the few across the United States. We have students from about 30 states, and 3 countries in our program. So it's really exciting to have the diversity and be able to see what's going on and to talk with others all across the country. So if this is something that you're interested in, I'll put my email in the chat box. Feel free to reach out to me. There are also other online programs that we're happy to steer you to if you're interested. The great thing about UCA's online graduate programs is it is a flat rate tuition. So it's $325 a credit hour, and that's flat rate, no fees on top of that. There's the TOP grant, the STEP grant, all of those that come out through the state. And then the reading specialist also qualifies for the TEACH grant. So we have several in our program that are attending at no cost through that TEACH grant. So I would love to share with you about all the great things happening at UCA. So feel free to reach out to me. I am so excited to have here with us today, Natalie Wexler. She is the author of The Knowledge Gap and the Writing Revolution. And if you haven't read those are must reads. They are wonderful, and I am so excited to have her with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Amy. I'm glad to be here, and I'm going to go ahead and share some slides, so hang on a moment. When I started looking into this, I thought, and I was told, and many other people thought, oops, now I can't get my slides to advance. Let me see. There we go. That the problem was actually high school, that's where scores were lowest, this gap was the widest, and the kids, were the most disengaged. But what I stumbled upon, or what was eventually explained to me, was that what I was told, what I thought many others thought was the bright spot in education, elementary school, is actually where a lot of the problems that become so obvious in high school begin. So what I'm talking about mostly here is how we approach reading instruction. And as I'm sure you know, as this infographic, Scarborough's rope, illustrates, there are lots of different components to reading ability. Lately, a lot of attention has been focused on problems with the way we approach teaching decoding, word recognition, those foundational skills. And there are widespread problems, and we really need to correct them. That's very important. But of course, you also need this other part of the rope to be a good reader, comprehension. And there's been a lot less attention lately focused on that. And there could be an assumption that what we're doing with teaching comprehension is just fine. It fits in with science. But I would argue that the problems with the way we've been approaching comprehension are actually even more widespread and better hidden than the problems with the way we've been approaching the decoding aspect of reading. And there are other infographics depicting reading that also, they're good as far as they go in showing that, decoding is a separate thing from comprehension, but they could, again, lead people to think that what we're doing with comprehension aligns with science. So one of these, you may be familiar with, the Simple View of Reading, which defines language comprehension as the ability to understand spoken language. And this one, the 5 pillars of early literacy, which comes out of the National Reading Panel report from 2000 that identified these pillars, including number 5, comprehension. So is there anything missing from these infographics? Well, we will come back to that. But first, let's take a look at the standard approach to teaching reading comprehension as it currently exists. So there'd be 2 basic parts, and one is that comprehension is conceived of as a set of strategies and skills. This is just one list I came across. There are many out there, but there are things like main idea and details and making inferences. And there will be a skill of the week, and the teacher will model that skill or strategy on a book or text that has been chosen not for its topic or its content, but for how well it lends itself to demonstrating, comparing, and contrasting, or whatever. And then the other part of the approach is that kids practice those skills and strategies individually on books that have been determined to be at their individual reading level, which could be well below their grade level, but they will be directed to baskets of books that correspond to their individual reading level. And again, these books are organized not by topic or content, but by things like sentence length and word length. And the theory here is that if kids diligently practice those skills, like finding the main idea, that they'll be able to apply them to any text that's put in front of them. They'll be able to find the main idea of a passage on an end of the year reading test or textbook down the road in high school or whatever, if they're good at finding the main idea. So let's just quickly test out that theory. Just going to show you a paragraph from a newspaper and ask you to find the main idea. And I'm sure you're all expert readers, so this should not be a challenge. So here goes. Much depended on the two overnight batsmen, but this duo perished either side of lunch, the latter a little unfortunate to be adjudged leg before, and with Andrew Simons too being shown the dreaded finger off an inside edge, the inevitable beckoned, bar the pyrotechnics of Michael Clarke in the ninth wicket. Now, if you're like me, you're having trouble figuring out what this is trying to tell you. It's not that you can't decode the words. You even know the meanings of individual words like adjudged and leg and before, but what does it mean to be adjudged leg before? And what I neglected to tell you, if you're having the same problem I am, is that I took this paragraph from a British newspaper, and it's describing a cricket match. If you were a cricket fan, you would probably have no trouble understanding this paragraph. But if you don't know anything about cricket, then this is really hard to understand. So this is something that cognitive scientists have known about for a long time. Back in the late 1980s, a couple of researchers wanted to know what is more important in comprehension. Is it generally applicable skills like finding the main idea, or is it how much you know about the topic you're reading about? This study has come to be called the baseball study. You may have heard of it. They chose the topic of baseball, these researchers, because they were doing this with 7th and 8th graders, and they figured there are a lot of kids out there who are not generally good readers, but they know a lot about baseball. So they took about 60 kids, they divided them into 4 groups depending on how well they had scored on a standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And then they gave them a passage to read describing a baseball game and tested their comprehension of that passage. And here's what they found. Basically, what made the difference was knowledge of the topic, not skill. So these kids, that green bar, those are the kids who were poor readers according to the test, but they knew a lot about baseball. These are the kids who were good readers according to the test, but they didn't know much about baseball. And as you can see, when the poor readers knew a lot about the topic they were reading about, they did quite well and outdid the quote unquote good readers who didn't know the topic. So this is not just one study. This has been the same kind of study has been done in other contexts, and the same results have always been found. And what these studies tell us, a couple things. One is that comprehension skills are not skills like riding a bike, playing tennis. They don't just get better with practice. It's going to depend to a large extent on the topic and how much the reader knows about it. And along with that, there's really no such thing as a fixed reading level. They're really just kind of approximations, and they could be, and it has been found that they are inaccurate. Different measures disagree with each other because, again, it's going to depend to a large extent on the topic and the reader's knowledge of the topic. So this can be kind of obvious, I think, with cricket or baseball or, molecular biology or any subject that has its own lingo. If you know the lingo, it's going to be easier to understand a text about it. What I think is less obvious is how much we rely on our background knowledge to make sense of almost anything we read. So for example, it has been found there's a very strong correlation between general academic knowledge, like knowing the answer to in what part of the body does pneumonia occur, and general reading comprehension. And that suggests that to boost kids' reading comprehension, we need to help them acquire as much academic knowledge and vocabulary as possible, and not just practice skills and strategies. So to illustrate what this looks like in the real world, I'm going to show you another paragraph from a newspaper, not about cricket this time. And this time I'd like you to think about what knowledge you're drawing on, what kinds of knowledge you're drawing on to understand this paragraph. So, and by the way, this paragraph is from a few years ago. It's somewhat dated. And so the president that's being referred to is not the same president we have now. 2 appeals by the president in his private capacity and represented by private lawyers have reached the Supreme Court in the past week. 1, Trump v. Vance, is a formal appeal from a ruling by the Federal Appeals Court in New York upholding the validity of a grand jury subpoena obtained by the Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus Vance, and served on the president's accountants for his personal and business tax records. So one kind of knowledge that you need here is some knowledge of the American legal system, right? Not deep knowledge, but you have to have some familiarity with things like an appeal, the Supreme Court, the Federal Appeals Court, a grand jury, a subpoena, a district attorney. And if you're missing that information, then this paragraph starts to get harder to understand, because there are these blanks. But beyond that, there are other things here that you need to know. You need to know some general academic vocabulary like capacity and validity, and the term served on when it's talking about a subpoena. And also, especially that second sentence has very complex structure and syntax. There are a lot of clauses there. And so if you're unfamiliar with those things, then you're really in trouble here. But how do you acquire that knowledge, that general academic vocabulary, the knowledge of complex syntax? It's really through knowledge of topics. It doesn't work to try to learn those things in the abstract. You need context. So let's talk now about what's going on in the mind. Why is it that prior relevant knowledge of either the topic or general academic vocabulary and complex syntax, why does that help us with comprehension? Well, that has to do with the way the mind takes in new information. And this is a diagram illustrating the process. And the important box here is this one labeled working memory. So that's the aspect of our consciousness where we are taking in new information.
Well, the thing of it is, they're the only.
Oh, could we mute somebody? We were taking in new information and trying to make sense of it. And the important thing to know about working memory is that it has very limited capacity. It can only juggle about maybe 5 new items for about 20 seconds before it starts to get overwhelmed. We start to forget things, and we don't have the cognitive capacity to understand or analyze or retain new information. And that burden that's placed on working memory is called, it's what cognitive scientists call cognitive load. Now, there is a way around the constraints on working memory, and that has to do with that box on the right, long-term memory, which is potentially infinite. So if we can just withdraw relevant information from long-term memory when we need it, we don't have to juggle that in working memory, and we have more capacity there for taking in new information. So for example, if you're reading about baseball and you already know what a double play is, you don't have to think about that. You don't have to wonder what it means. You don't have to break off reading to go look it up. You can just attend to the information in the paragraph or the article. But there are a couple of tricks here. One is, first, we have to transfer new information from working memory to long-term memory. And second, we need to be able to retrieve that relevant information when we need it. So the best way to transfer new information to long-term memory is to attach some meaning to it. And that what helps is explaining it to somebody else in your own words, orally or in writing. And for retrieval, what we need is to practice retrieving an item. The more we practice retrieving an item, the more likely we are to be able to get at it when we need it. So one thing that helps with retrieval practice is quizzing, just trying to recall information we've slightly forgotten through quizzing. Even better is trying to recall that information and explaining it to somebody else in our own words. So that's the basic lay of the land here with why this prior knowledge helps. But what does all this have to do with those test score gaps I started out talking about? Well, passages on reading comprehension tests, like any written text, make certain assumptions about what the reader already knows. Writers don't explain every term they use, because if they did, their writing would be really tedious and nobody would want to read it. And of course, the passages on reading tests are not related to any information that kids might have acquired in school. Well, they're designed not to be, because the idea is we're not testing their content knowledge. We're testing their general reading skill or ability. But of course, if you don't have enough background knowledge to understand the passage on the test, you never get a chance to demonstrate your skill at making inferences, finding the main idea, whatever. So to illustrate what that looks like in the real world, I'm going to show you another paragraph. This one is from a released item from a third grade reading comprehension. In one of the most remote places in the world, the Canadian Arctic, a people have survived over 1,000 years. They are the Inuit. For the Inuit, the Arctic is a place teeming with life. Depending on how far north they live, the Inuit find everything from caribou herds and polar bears to beluga whales. Now, to us as educated adults, that paragraph looks pretty straightforward, but there are actually a lot of words and phrases here that many third graders won't be familiar with, unless maybe they live in Alaska. And for those third graders, this paragraph is going to start looking like this. Kind of like that cricket paragraph if you don't know much about cricket. So this is going to place a heavy burden on working memory to try to figure out what this means. Now, some third graders obviously will know these words and phrases, or many of them. They tend to be the third graders who come from more highly educated families and have had exposure to this vocabulary. Maybe they've been to Alaska, or at least their parents read books about these things or mentioned them in conversation. But the other kids rely on school for this kind of information. And unfortunately, in our current system, they are the least likely to get it there. So why is that? Well, that has to do with our elementary curriculum. So a little quiz. How much time do you think elementary students spend each day on ELA or reading, math, science, social studies, the arts? So I'm going to show you the answers from a very large database that some researchers collected. And what we see here is that the bulk of time, about 2 hours on average, is spent on ELA reading, about an hour and a half on math. And then according to this graph, about 30 minutes a day on science and social studies, and somewhat less on arts and music. And I think this is optimistic in terms of how much time elementary students get on science and social studies. I've talked to a lot of teachers, been in schools where it may be in the schedule that there's half an hour a day for one of these subjects, but often what happens is, educators are worried about the reading and math scores, and so they devote that time instead to reading and math. And especially that's true in schools where test scores are low. And the time spent on reading is often spent practicing comprehension skills and strategies in one way or another. And the problem is that those subjects that are being marginalized or even eliminated, science, social studies, and the arts, they have the most potential to build the kind of academic knowledge and vocabulary that kids actually need to do well on reading tests. And not just on reading tests, but in high school and in life. So this study, that the researchers that put this graph together, they also looked at what happens if kids get an extra half an hour a day on social studies beyond the average. And they found that was correlated with higher reading scores. They also looked at what happens if kids get an extra half hour a day on ELA or reading. And they found that was not correlated with higher reading scores. So in our well-intentioned effort to boost reading scores, we've really been shooting ourselves in the foot. And that's the study that this is taken from. So why did it look to me and others like high school is the problem? Well, that has to do with the fact that having prior relevant knowledge doesn't just help you understand what you're reading. It also helps you retain new information and vocabulary from what you're reading. It's been said that knowledge is like Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. And that's another way of saying we have more capacity and working memory to retain the information we're reading or taking in. And some kids are going to start out with more of that other half of the Velcro, more academic knowledge and vocabulary. And in our leveled reading system, they're going to be reading more complex text with more information, and they're going to be in a better position to retain new vocabulary, new information from those texts because of the Velcro. That's going to enable them to then get more complex text because they have more vocabulary. So they're going to maybe be shooting ahead. But the other kids who start out with less Velcro, they're going to be relegated to simpler texts, and they're going to be less likely to retain whatever information or vocabulary is in there because they don't have enough Velcro. And so what that leads to is something that's been called the Matthew effect in reading, which is a reference to the Gospel of Matthew and the part that basically says the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And so as you can see, the gap between the quote unquote good readers and poor readers becomes wider and wider as time goes on. And so by the time kids get to high school, this gap can be very wide and very difficult to narrow. So that's the first kind of knowledge gap. And that's why building knowledge is going to be most effective if it starts early, while students are still acquiring foundational skills. And I'll talk more about how that can work in a few minutes. But the one problem here is it can look like the skills and strategies approach is working at lower grade levels. And that's basically because the texts we're asking graders to read usually don't assume a whole lot of academic knowledge and vocabulary. So it can look like they're getting better at, finding the main idea. But then when they get to higher grade levels and the texts do start assuming academic knowledge, they may well hit a wall if they don't have it. So it can backfire. So that's one kind of knowledge gap. There's also a related second gap, which is the difference between what we assume high school students know and what many actually do know. And this narrow focus on reading and math can continue through middle school, especially where test scores are low. And so kids can enter high school without knowing some very basic things about the world. They may not know the difference between a city and a state, or a country and a continent. They may not be able to find the United States on a map of the world or their hometown on a map of the United States. And they may know very little about historical events. They may even lack a sense of historical chronology. That's not because they can't learn those things, they couldn't learn those things. It's because they hadn't been given access to that information in a way that will stick. And yet, we give them textbooks like this and expect them to read and understand them. And if you're missing that much knowledge about the world, this is going to be very frustrating, both for you and your teacher. No wonder students in high school are sometimes disengaged. And of course, the tests at higher grade levels also assume more knowledge and vocabulary. This is part of a released item from the SAT. I'll just read the first sentence to give you an idea of the kind of knowledge vocabulary that's assumed. The nature of impeachment, a narrowly channeled exception to the separation of powers maxim. So when I stumbled across this problem, our failure to start building knowledge in elementary school and its enormous ramifications, I was really surprised because I thought I knew a lot about education. I'd been writing about it as a journalist. I was on the board of a charter school. I'd been, reading everything I could get my hands on and listening to experts. And I never heard anybody talk about this problem, or I didn't even know that the elementary teachers were not really trying to build much academic knowledge. And I'd been in elementary classrooms. I just didn't know what I was looking at. Now, there were some people who were aware of this issue and were very concerned about it, had been for years, but I came to realize they were really just talking to each other. And it had been written about, but in a kind of dry academic way. And I thought, well, maybe if somebody writes a more journalistic narrative account of this issue, that would help get it into the conversation, the public conversation about education. And so that's the book that I tried to write. And as concerned as I was about this issue when I was researching and writing the book, which now came out 3 years ago, I'm even more concerned now because we know that with remote and hybrid learning, and we're still living with that legacy, the situation has become more urgent than ever. That the kids who were not being well served by our education system before the pandemic are the ones who have borne the most negative impact from remote learning. So we can't afford to just go back to what we were doing before the pandemic that wasn't working. We can't wait any longer to change what we are doing. And the good news is I didn't write this book just to describe the problem. I also wanted to know what we can do about it. And the good news is there is a lot that teachers and administrators and policymakers can do. So let's start with what individual teachers can do to help narrow the knowledge gap. So several things. One, instead of organizing read alouds just by the skill of the week, organize read alouds by a topic and spend at least 2 or 3 weeks reading a series of texts on a topic, like say, sea mammals. Kids need to hear the same information, the same concepts and vocabulary repeatedly in different contexts in order for those things to stick in long-term memory. And then secondly, ask questions about the content that put it in the foreground rather than putting skills in the foreground. And I'll give an illustration of what that could look like in a minute. But instead of, for example, saying, okay, we're working on inferences this week, who can make an inference? Ask a question about the content that just requires kids to make an inference. That's going to work better. They don't have to jump through that additional hoop of thinking, wait, what's an inference? How do I make one? They can just go straight to the content and get in the habit of making inferences about what they're learning. And then rather than organize the classrooms just by reading level or by broad topics like animals, which you might see in this slide, organize them by specific topics, especially topics that you've been maybe reading aloud about and discussing. Like you've been reading aloud and discussing sea mammals for 2 weeks. Try putting out a basket of books about sea mammals at different levels of complexity. And remember the baseball study, once kids have some information about a topic, you may be surprised at what level they can read at. And generally just be skeptical about reading levels. Don't, if a kid wants to try a book you think might be too hard, let him or her try it and see what happens. And then spend lots of time on meaty social studies and science topics. Remember, fiction definitely has its place in the elementary classroom, but those subjects are the ones that have the most potential to build the kind of knowledge and vocabulary that's going to boost reading comprehension, especially at higher grade levels. So you may wonder, well, where am I going to find resources that will help me do these things? So there's some options that are free online to either substitute for or supplement maybe some curricula that don't have a lot of content and that don't focus on building knowledge. So there are several free downloadable curriculum out there, and you could just try one unit or even one lesson, although I'd say trying a whole module or unit is probably going to work better. One of them is called Core Knowledge Language Arts. There's a paid version, but also a free version through the Core Knowledge Foundation at coreknowledge.org. There's EL Education, which covers K through 8. Bookworms is also available as an open educational resource. So those are ways to sort of experiment, get your feet wet with some knowledge building curriculum. And then there are also text sets. They're not entire curriculum, but they are, as I was talking about, groups of text organized around a topic that would, keep you going for 2 or 3 weeks on a topic. And again, there's some free resources out there. And I can send a PDF of these slides later on if so you don't have to worry about taking notes. But you can find some text set ideas at Student Achievement Partners. If you just Google sets, you will also find them. And they're organized by topic and grade level. Also, other free resources, ReadWorks, Common Lit, which is geared, I believe, to the middle school grades, and Newsela.com. So those are some ideas, but there is a limit to what any individual teacher is going to be able to do to narrow the knowledge gap. And that's because building knowledge is a gradual, cumulative process that extends not just across one school year, but across grade levels. And no individual teacher can control what happens the year before, the year after. So somebody at a higher level will need to step in for this gap to really narrow much. And so what can administrators and policymakers do? Well, the first and crucial step, I would say, is to adopt a content-focused elementary literacy curriculum that goes deeply into topics in social studies, science, and the arts. There are now maybe 5 or 6 such curricula that I'm somewhat familiar with out there that do a good job of this. They all cover different topics, different bodies of knowledge in different ways. So there's no one right way to do this, no one list of things, but they all have at least a couple of important things in common. And one is that they are organized by topics and rather than skills, and they spend at least 2 or 3 weeks on a topic They also will give all students in the classroom access in some way to complex text that is at quote unquote grade level or above that they may not be able to read themselves. And that may be through read alouds and discussion. And I will talk more about why that's important. But first, how do you know whether a curriculum is actually building knowledge effectively? So here's some red flags that you might want to look for. Even with some curricula that are labeled content rich or have some seal of approval, you know, that may not be totally reliable. So here are some things to look for. You don't want the curriculum to be so stuffed full of stuff that a teacher cannot possibly get through it all in one school year, because teachers then will need to be making choices about what to cover and what to leave out, and they may not be equipped, for through no fault of their own, they may not be equipped to make the best choices. Secondly, you want to be alert to really thin content or themes rather than meaty topics. So something like childhood around the world, probably not going to be all that interesting because it's going to be superficial. It's also probably not going to repeat the same vocabulary and topic concepts enough for kids to really get that into long-term memory. So you want topics. Also be on the lookout for new information being introduced without enough attention to background knowledge. Are kids are they going to have the knowledge to understand this new information? Be on the alert for skills and strategies being put in the foreground rather than the content itself. Watch out for over-reliance on levels and or disconnected texts that are not organized around the topic that has been read aloud about and discussed, or not connected to each other. And I'm going to talk more about writing in a few minutes, but also look out for writing that is not linked to curriculum content. That's a big problem, having kids write about some other topic. And again, excerpts rather than whole texts, like themes, it's probably not going to be as interesting, as engaging, as rich. And of course, you need a curriculum in the lower grade levels that spend sufficient time on foundational skills, also crucial for turning kids into good readers. So those are the things to look for. And now let's take a look at why a curriculum is so important to enabling kids to read and write at higher levels and what that has to do with cognitive load. The first thing we need to realize is that literacy is about much more than reading. And there are really 4 aspects of literacy, but I'm just going to talk about 2 of them at the moment. One is listening, especially listening to written text being read aloud. That's really important for a couple of reasons. One is that kids can take in information better through listening than through their own reading for quite a while. According to this study that was done many years ago, listening comprehension exceeds reading comprehension on average through about age 13. You know, that's because they don't have to think about decoding, or even once they've got decoding down, they don't have to think about where do I put the emphasis in this sentence. They have more, when they're not dealing with those things, they have more capacity in working memory to attend to and absorb the information, the meaning, and the vocabulary. Another reason it's important to read aloud from written text is that written language is almost always more complex than spoken language. And if kids are ultimately going to be able to understand that complex written language themselves, they have to get familiar with it. And reading aloud from complex text is a great way to familiarize them with that more complex language. But not just listening, also speaking. Because remember, in order for stuff to stick in long-term memory, you need to talk about it. You need to use those concepts that you've heard, that vocabulary you've just heard. That's what's going to make it stick. So speaking is also crucial. But so before students are fluent readers, they acquire knowledge most efficiently through listening to complex text and speaking about it. But let's look at how a curriculum can put all 4 aspects of literacy together in a way that will boost student learning, enable them to read and write at higher levels. So we've got listening, speaking, and also reading and writing. These are the 4 basic components of literacy, but there's a crucial difference between them. Listening and speaking, as I've just mentioned, are easier. They impose less of a burden on working memory. they're going to be the way to first get information into long-term memory. And then that information can fuel the ability to do these way more demanding tasks of reading and writing. These are the things we have to explicitly teach kids, and they impose a much heavier cognitive load. But if you've already got the information you're reading and writing about in long-term memory, then you have more capacity in working memory to deal with decoding, all the things that are involved in writing that are very difficult, which I'll talk about in a minute. So an effective curriculum will, first of all, focus on content, spend at least 2 to 3 weeks on a single topic. Second, give all students access to the same complex text through read-alouds and discussion. And crucially, engage students in listening, speaking, reading, and writing about the same content. This is not what we generally do. We have kids reading about a different topic and writing about yet a different topic. And that's not taking advantage of what the knowledge we can equip them with in long-term memory. So let's take another look at those infographics and see if there might be anything missing. So here's Scarborough's rope again. So, you know, I not to criticize it, it's just that in the context of a lot of assumptions about what language comprehension consists of, this could be misleading to educators. So one thing that could be misleading is that background knowledge and vocabulary are presented as two separate things here, two separate strands. But they aren't really. I mean, it is important to teach specific vocabulary words, but the only way kids can acquire as much vocabulary as they really need is through building knowledge. We just cannot possibly explicitly teach all the vocabulary they need, and that vocabulary isn't going to stick unless they have the context for it, unless it's in the context of knowledge. And another thing here is background knowledge, you know, I think teachers are familiar with the importance of background knowledge, and one strategy is activating background knowledge, but that will not work if kids don't have relevant knowledge to activate. So activating background knowledge won't work in that situation. Teachers may also scan a text to see what background knowledge do kids need to understand this text that they might not have, and maybe define a few words for them before reading text. And that might help get them through that text, but remember, without further repetition of those words in a good, meaningful context, that knowledge is unlikely to stick. So kids may well not remember the meanings of those words when they encounter them again later on in text. So quick injections of background knowledge are not enough to get those words to stick in long-term memory. And then let's take another look at the simple view of reading. We've got language comprehension defined here as the ability to understand spoken language. Well, the problem with that is reading comprehension doesn't just depend on spoken language, because remember, written language is more complex than spoken language. So it's not just about having conversations with kids. It's also about familiarizing them with that complex written language through reading aloud and discussion. And then lastly, the 5 pillars of early literacy. I have a number of problems with this infographic. One, again, it gives the impression that comprehension should be taught as a skill, like phonics, which, as we've seen, doesn't really work. It also, as with the reading rope, separates vocabulary from background knowledge or comprehension. It doesn't even mention background knowledge, actually. And in fact, the National Reading Panel did not look at any of the research, like the baseball study, which was out there, and other similar studies, anything about the role of background knowledge and comprehension. They just looked at studies of comprehension, skills and strategy instruction. And that's leaving out a huge piece of the puzzle. So I'd also like to talk about the 2, actually turned out to be 3 classrooms that I followed through the school year. To give you an idea of these different approaches in practice. And these 2 classrooms were, of course, not identical. No 2 classrooms are. One was 1st grade, one was 2nd grade. But they were pretty similar in many ways. The kids in both these classrooms all of them came from low-income families. They were all children of color. And the teachers in both of these classrooms were really good, hardworking teachers. But what was going on in these classrooms was like they were on 2 different planets. And the main reason for that was the curriculum, what was being taught. So I wish I had video to show you, but I don't. I do have anchor charts or posters that I took pictures of. And this is a typical anchor chart from the skills focused classroom using a Basel reader focused on comprehension skills. All of the posters were on skills, and the teacher in this classroom had a very hard time getting a discussion going because these 6-year-olds really did not have much to say about the abstract concept of main idea or sequence of events or the difference between a caption and a subtitle. They just weren't interested. The other classroom was full of posters that looked like this, just chock full of content. This happens to, the curriculum that was being used was Core Knowledge Language Arts, which was the only one that was out there at the time I was doing my research, the only content-rich knowledge building curriculum. And this poster is from a unit on Greek myths. This one is about the myth of Daedalus and Icarus. And the kids in this grade classroom were having amazing, thoughtful discussions. We so underestimate what young children are capable of doing. And they were also incredibly engaged. They often did not want the teacher to stop reading. They often had their hands up when it was time to end. So it's really quite different. But I want to point out a few things about this poster. And one is the vocabulary. The words of the day are desperately, plummeted, and foresight. Those are sophisticated words for any group of second graders. This group most of them came from non-English speaking families, and some of them were still learning English themselves. And yet they were learning these words. They were using them not just in classroom discussion, but sometimes in their own conversation. And these words they're probably not going to see them on a 3rd grade or 4th grade reading comprehension test, but they're going to lodge in their long-term memory and serve them very well in years to come. And that's what we need to be thinking about. Not just what do they need now this year, but what are they going to need in 10 years? These words are going to stick partly because they're encountering them repeatedly, and they're encountering them in a very engaging context. So for example, this sentence, Icarus's wings melted and he plummeted into the sea. That's a very vivid image. The other thing I'd like to point out about this poster is it kind of looks like the teacher is teaching skills. She has this question, predict, what is Daedalus's plan? And these boxes labeled cause and effect, but she's not trying to teach the abstract skill of making predictions or the skill of determining cause and effect. She's bringing those things in as ways to get kids thinking about the content. And she's asking those questions that put the content in the foreground rather than the skill. So a question like, what is Daedalus's plan, just implicitly requires kids to make a prediction and gets them in the habit of doing asking themselves those kinds of questions. So I do want to spend a few minutes on writing because we really don't pay enough attention to that aspect of literacy. It's not only important in itself, but it can be a really incredibly powerful lever for building academic knowledge and vocabulary. And that again has to do with cognitive architecture, working memory, long-term memory. So remember that working memory is limited in capacity, and it's important to transfer things to long-term memory and be able to retrieve them. And that explaining something to someone else in your own words is a great way of doing both of those things. And that's what writing does. But the problem is it's also the hardest thing we ask students to do. And that again is because of working memory and its limitations, the cognitive load that writing imposes on working memory. Writing is actually much harder than reading. It's expressive rather than receptive. And yet we kind of expect kids to pick it up, but that load makes it difficult. Inexperienced writers may be juggling everything from letter formation if they're young to spelling, which we know is difficult in English, to what words to use, how to organize their thoughts, the content, the meaning of the content they're writing about. And remember that peculiar, more sophisticated syntax and vocabulary of written language. And all of this creates cognitive load and stress also, which also places a burden on working memory. So it's very easy for inexperienced writers to quickly become overwhelmed when we ask them to write. So writing instruction has enormous potential power, but we haven't unlocked that power because first of all, we've underestimated how hard it is. And we've asked even kindergartners to write at length. If writing is hard, writing at length is only going to be harder. And we've also tried to teach it in isolation. We've had kids write about personal experience or topics in a separate writing curriculum. And that's wasting the golden opportunity to use writing to build the knowledge we want kids to acquire. So to unlock the power of writing, we need to do at least 3 things. First, we need to modulate that heavy cognitive load. And that often means starting at the sentence level, if that's what students need, no matter what grade level they're in, because there are a lot of kids at upper grade levels who've never really learned to construct a good sentence. And then we need to teach grammar and conventions in the context of students' own writing, not in the abstract, which doesn't work. And we don't need to just, we shouldn't just expect them to pick it up from reading, because that also doesn't work for many kids. What does work is to teach it in the context of students' own writing, which is a much more manageable task if they're starting at the sentence level, rather than turning in 5 pages of error-filled writing and where do you begin? And then thirdly, embed writing activities as much as possible in the content of the core curriculum. So I know of only one method that combines all of those things, and that's the Writing Revolution, which is not my method. I'm a co-author of the book, but the method was developed by Judith Hochman, my co-author, who is a veteran educator who developed this over many years. So just to give you a quick idea of what this method entails, the book goes into it, of course, in much more detail, and it's really meant to be a guide to implementing the method in the classroom. But let's take a look at some of the activities that build writing skills and knowledge at the same time. And let's begin at the most basic level, the concept of what is a sentence, as opposed to a fragment of a sentence, an incomplete sentence. This is basic, but it's actually quite complex. And for many students, it does not work to just give them the abstract definition of a sentence as, it has a subject and a predicate and it expresses a complete thought. What does work is giving them repeated practice in distinguishing a complete sentence from a fragment. And this, as I mentioned, I think, can be embedded in any curriculum content, not just ELA, but across the curriculum. It can also be adapted to any grade level. But let's say, for example, you're teaching this poem, The New Colossus, which is the one on the Statue of Liberty. And you also want to teach kids how to distinguish a complete sentence from a fragment. You would give them groups of words like this with no punctuation. And the first thing they have to do is identify what's a fragment here and what's a sentence, putting an F for fragment and an S for a sentence. And then this is where the knowledge building comes in. They need to turn those fragments into complete sentences by recalling information they may have slightly forgotten and putting it into their own words. So this one, welcomes newcomers from faraway countries, the first one. Statue of Liberty welcomes newcomers from faraway countries. The Statue of Liberty is not actually mentioned in the poem, so they need to already know that. Obviously, they can't do this unless they already know something about this poem and its context. And then this next one, the Mother of Exiles, well, they can find that phrase in the poem. And then what do they do with this phrase? Well, it says there's a torch, it says glows worldwide welcome. So they can put those things together to create a sentence. The Mother of Exiles, a famous monument, holds a torch with a welcoming glow. And that a famous monument, of course, they're supplying that. But that's also a structure they will have been taught. That phrase, a famous monument, is an appositive, a phrase describing a noun or noun phrase. And that's not something we use in conversation. That's a feature of written language. So that will have been explicitly taught as part of the method. And then this complete sentence, they just need to punctuate and capitalize appropriately, which is also important to learn. So that's one sentence level activity that can build knowledge. Also, there's an activity called Because, But, and So. And that consists of giving students a sentence stem that they need to finish in 3 different ways with each of these conjunctions. So let's say you're teaching this book, Hidden Figures, the true story of 4 Black women in the space race. You could give students these conjunctions, or these sentence stems with the different conjunctions. Dorothy Vaughan was a computer at NASA because, but, and so. Now, simple as they are, each of these conjunctions require students to retrieve a different kind of information that they may have slightly forgotten, but is already in long-term memory, and put it into their own words. And but is going to be more difficult than because it's asking for contrasting information. So is going to ask for a cause and effect relationship, but it's a different one from because. So there are different ways students could complete these sentence stems, but here are some possible responses. Because she was very good at math, but she was not allowed to use the whites only bathrooms there. So she worked on experiments to make planes safer. So let's also take a look at how these activities can build knowledge and writing skills across the curriculum. For example, even in math, let's say you're teaching about decimals and fractions. You could use because, but, and so to facilitate that instruction and also teach writing skills. Fractions are like decimals because they are all parts of wholes, but they are written differently, so they can be used interchangeably. And math teachers may feel like, you know, I'm not a writing teacher, I don't want to spend time on this. But once they see that this actually really powerfully deepens students' knowledge of the content, they often become real converts to using this as something that's just woven into their instruction. And these activities, these sentence level activities, can be adapted for young children who are maybe still learning how to form letters, how to spell, or English language learners of any age. And one way to do that is by providing pre-printed strips with words on them. So let's say this is an example for the early elementary grades. Let's say you've been reading this book about frogs aloud, perhaps. So you could give students these kinds of strips that they need to match appropriately. And right now they're mismatched. So that top green strip says before frog embryos hatch, and next to it is the yellow strip that says they eat insects and worms. And if kids remember what they've heard of the book, they know that that is not true about what frog embryos do, and they need to find the right yellow strip to go with that green strip. So they can rearrange the strips like this. Before frog embryos hatch, comma, they're also learning about punctuation. They eat their egg yolks, period. But these activities, these sentence level activities, they are not just for kids. And some teachers at higher grade levels may feel, you know, my 10th grader is supposed to be writing essays, and isn't this really just kid stuff? No, actually, the rigor is going to depend on the content. So for example, I'm going to give you a sentence stem to complete about this guy. This is an 18th century philosopher named Immanuel Kant. Okay, so here's the sentence stem. Immanuel Kant believed that space and time are subjective forms of human sensibility, but now I can't finish that sentence. And you really need to know a lot about the philosophy of Immanuel Kant to be able to do that. So this is not just for kids. It can even once students do know how to use a conjunction like but, this can still be a very effective knowledge building activity. But the method does go beyond sentences to outlines, which kids can do even before they have mastered how to construct sentences, and outlining itself is a powerful knowledge building activity and can be done orally and collaboratively, even when kids are very young. And then paragraphs and even argumentative essays. But this sentence level work is what lays the foundation for lengthier independent writing. So I'll show you what that means. So this is a single paragraph outline that kids will not just be given and told to fill out. They will have been explicitly taught how to fill out these outlines. And also they will have been taught the skills needed to create an outline and a paragraph. So this topic sentence, for example, that is using what's called an appositive. Martin Luther King Jr., a civil rights leader, fought peacefully to end segregation in America. The appositive is a civil rights leader. They will have been taught how to use that, what it is, what an appositive is, and they will have been told that that's a very good way to construct a topic sentence. So that'll help them get started. And then we have these details. These are in the form of notes. They will have been taught, first of all, how to come up with details related to a topic sentence, and also how to use abbreviations and symbols for notes for their detailed sentences. And then we have the concluding sentence. Although Martin Luther King never saw segregation end, his dream came true and his legacy is honored every 3rd January in the United States. Students will have been taught how to use a subordinating conjunction like although, again, not something that is heard often in conversation, this construction. And they will have been told that's a good way to construct a concluding sentence. So here they have a kind of roadmap for a paragraph, and they can essentially transfer this information to a paragraph pretty easily. They can just copy the topic sentence and the concluding sentence. And then here again is where sentence level skills come in. They convert their notes into complete sentences. And they also are going to draw on some of the skills they've been taught to connect those sentences. So for example, they're going to be using appropriate transitional words and phrases that do not usually appear in spoken language. And how do they learn how to use those transitional words and phrases? Again, through sentence level activities that themselves build knowledge while laying the groundwork for longer writing. So this is a sentence level activity that embedded in content about the American colonies. And first, they're given a sentence like first one, the colonists were angry that they had to follow English laws and pay taxes to England. And then a transition word, therefore, and they have to come up with the rest of that sentence. So those are some examples of how to use writing to build both writing skills and knowledge. And I would also argue that writing instruction like this is also a more effective way to teach those strategies, those comprehension strategies that we try to get out through our reading comprehension instruction. Things like finding the main idea and supporting details. When you learn to construct an outline for a paragraph, and you can sentence and come up with supporting details, that's what you're doing. You're making inferences. When you are writing, you're constantly connecting bits of information, figuring out, how they're related, comparing and contrasting, all of these things. That's what we do when we're writing. And why is it more effective than just teaching reading comprehension strategies? Well, first of all, the content is necessarily in the foreground. You can't write about the abstract skill of making inferences. You have to be doing it with the content. And secondly, you can really tell if students are getting it. If they could be going off and it looks like they're practicing finding the main idea with the texts they're reading, but how do you really know? Well, when you get a piece of writing, you can tell if they're learning how to do that. And you're reaching every student, not just the ones who are participating in class discussion, raising their hand, every student. And it can be adapted. Of course, there are going to be different levels of writing ability in a classroom, but as the book explains, all of these activities can be adapted and differentiated for different students. So effective writing instruction can turbocharge any content-rich curriculum, but if the curriculum is focused on comprehensive skills and strategies, it won't work usually, because if you're jumping from one topic to the next with skills in the foreground, so it's class today, but zebras tomorrow, kids may not have the opportunity to acquire enough information about any one topic to enable them to write about it. So you do need to start with curriculum. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that that's it, that's all you need to do, because this kind of teaching, this approach is going to be very different from what most teachers, especially at the elementary level, are used to. And so there may be some obstacles in the way of getting it implemented effectively. And one big potential obstacle could be testing. And I'm not against tests, period, because they have uncovered a lot of otherwise hidden inequities in our education system. But of course, they were never meant to be guides to instruction, which often is what they have become. And also, as I mentioned before, they're not tied to any particular body of knowledge, including the bodies of knowledge covered by each of these knowledge building curricula out there. And that can be discouraging because you may know that your students know a lot about, the myth of Daedalus and Icarus and the human digestive system or whatever, but they get to the test and the passages are about the Inuit or Amelia Earhart or whatever. And they may not yet have the critical mass of academic knowledge and vocabulary that would enable them to understand any passage that's thrown at them. That will happen eventually if they continue to get exposure to a knowledge building curriculum. But it's impossible to predict with any given test and any given student when that point will be reached. So it can be discouraging, and test scores may go up, but they may not. And if they don't, it's important to remember that that doesn't mean the knowledge building curriculum is not working. It just means there hasn't been enough time. And there may be other obstacles in the way of effective implementation. And I put them in 3 basic categories. One is intellectual, obstacles of the head. And that's because everything I've been talking about, the baseball study, et cetera, is probably unfamiliar information to a lot of teachers. It's not what they've heard in their pre-service training. In fact, they may have been told that it's not important for kids to remember factual information because they can just Google it, which of course imposes a heavy cognitive load. So it's natural to be skeptical of information that contradicts everything you've been hearing. So that's one possible obstacle. And another is obstacles, emotional obstacles, obstacles of the heart. And that really has to do with the fact that if you've been teaching in a certain way for years in the sincere belief that you are helping students, and somebody comes along and tells you, actually, no, you may have been holding them back, that is a very difficult and painful message to hear. And all of us as human beings are likely to raise defenses against taking in that kind of painful message. And actually what amazes and impresses me is how many educators, despite the painfulness of that message, are embracing it. And to me, that speaks to how much they care about their students. And then lastly, there are behavioral obstacles of habit, which really has to do with the fact that teaching is an incredibly complex activity. And in the moment when you're juggling so many different things, it can be hard to remember to do things differently. It can be very easy to fall into longstanding habits. But none of these obstacles are insurmountable. Teachers are overcoming them as we speak on a daily basis. It often, however, will take some time and some patience and some support, basically some kind of professional development, but not professional development as we have known it. So not a one-day workshop, a half-day workshop on how to foster critical thinking in the abstract. That has been found not to work. Other kinds of professional development, though, have been found to work much better. And one thing that makes professional development effective is that if it's rooted in the specific content of the curriculum. So not how to foster critical thinking in the abstract, but if your students are learning about the myth of Daedalus and Icarus, how do you get them to think critically about that content? And secondly, not just a one-day or half-day workshop, but something that's ongoing and cyclical, and that might include coaching, might include teachers coming together and talking about the new things that they're trying. And also, crucially, professional development that enables teachers to understand not just how to change their practice, but also why it's important. And often teachers don't get enough of that kind of information. So I'd just like to close with an anecdote I heard when I was researching the book that to me, I heard lots of stories from teachers who have switched from the skills-focused approach to comprehension to a knowledge-building approach and how it really changed what they've done. But I think this anecdote illustrates how the power of knowledge-building curriculum, not just to expand kids' knowledge, but also to change teachers' expectations. So this is a story about a second grade teacher in Reno, Nevada, whose school had recently switched to a knowledge building curriculum, which happened again to be CKLA because this was years ago and that was the only one around. And this teacher was giving one of her kids a reading test to determine his individual reading level. And this was a little boy who was struggling like crazy. And the teacher happened to see in the testing kit that there was a text on the topic of westward expansion. That's why this picture is here. And that happened to be the topic that the class had just spent 2 or 3 weeks learning about. But the text was at a 4th grade level, and this was a struggling 2nd grade reader. Just out of curiosity, the teacher handed the text to the boy, and to her surprise, he read it with 98% accuracy and 100% comprehension. And I think that experience changed the teacher's idea of who this little boy was and what he was capable of doing. And it probably changed that little boy's idea of who he was as well. And this is, again, a reason I feel so much urgency about this topic is we are making untold numbers of children out there feel like they are failures, when in fact, it's the system that has failed them. So just to sum up before we go to questions, reading comprehension depends more on background knowledge and academic vocabulary than comprehension skills. Students who start out with less academic knowledge fall farther behind every year if they're not acquiring it. To build knowledge, schools need to adopt content-rich curriculum that begins in kindergarten and integrates listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and connects them around the same topics. To ensure the curriculum is implemented well, schools need to provide ongoing support grounded in specific content. And a knowledge building approach, combined, of course, with effective foundational skills instruction, also important, can enable all children to reach their full potential and meet or exceed high expectations. So thank you. And I'm happy to take questions, but if you do think of questions later on, you can always contact me through my website, nataliewexler.com. So I'll stop sharing there and see if we've got questions.
Okay, so everyone was listening so carefully. We don't have any questions in our chat box, but if you would like to ask a question, feel free to use the reactions feature and click the raise hand button, and we will open the floor.
I guess I covered everything thoroughly if there are no questions.
Oh, you just got it all. All right. Well, Melissa put in the chat box about when you'll receive your PD certificate. If you remained in the session for the entire session. If you're interested in any of our graduate programs, there's a graduate program interest form linked there, and you will have an evaluation form. Okay, here we have a question. Rachel said she was able to check both books out from the local library.
Great.
Well, Rachel, I'll have some good news coming for you. And I can't wait to read them. Do you have any other books you recommend?
Oh yeah, well, there are a number. So I don't know if you're familiar with Dan Willingham. Daniel Willingham is a professor of psychology at UVA who's written a number of books now explaining in very accessible terms the cognitive science behind reading. There's The Reading Mind and Why Students Don't Like School. So I would definitely recommend his books. There's also, if you want to go a little broader into the implications of cognitive science for teaching and learning in general, I'd say Dan does cover some of that in his work, but also there's a British educator and writer about education named Daisy Christodoulou. It's like Christ with Odulu at the end, so Christodoulou, and she's written several books, but the one I recommend to begin with is one called 7 Myths About Education, which sort of talks about how a lot of the assumptions that teachers are learn during their training and acquire during their training really conflict with what cognitive science has found about how learning works, with some very well-established evidence. And that sort of disjunction between what prospective teachers learn at ed school and what psychologists maybe on the same university campus are teaching their students, that just makes teachers' jobs harder than they need to be, and it makes students' jobs harder than they need to be. So I would really encourage, if you have an interest in any of this, to check out those books and go a bit deeper into the implications of cognitive science for teaching and learning.
We have a thank you from one of our participants that said it was a wonderful and helpful presentation, and she is a parent that has joined us, so that was great.
Oh, great.
And I have a kindergarten teacher that says she suspects her grade level may be resistant to this change of knowledge base rather than skills based, but she'll use this info to share with them to move in a better direction. Do you have any suggestions to help them when they meet resistance?
Yes, I mean, it can be tough, especially if you're the only one in your building or your district who seems to be interested in this kind of change. I mean, there is definitely strength in numbers. So if you can find somebody else who's interested in, in experimenting or learning more about this. But I do think that the most effective way to overcome skepticism or even hostility is, if possible, to show people what this approach looks like in the classroom, in practice. So if you can find a school, it may be in your district or a neighboring district, or you maybe do this on, remotely, that is using one of these knowledge building curricula, and maybe has done it for at least a year, because first year of anything might be challenging. But talk to the teachers, observe the classrooms, see that kids are really engaged, that the teachers really like it, the parents are usually thrilled. I think that can be a very powerful experience that can make people think, gee, maybe I do need to question some of the things that I've assumed are right, and maybe look into changing what I'm doing. And another thing you could do is, if you can get permission to just try out in your classroom, pilot one of these knowledge building curricula. Obviously, it's better if it's just more than one person, but even if one person tries it, other teachers in the building, in the district, may become curious. I've heard of this happening, and they may want to try it as well, and that can lead to a movement for change. So that's what I would suggest.
Okay. I think that's everything. I will email you all once, Natalie, you'll send me that PDF of the presentation.
Yes.
And I will share that with all of you. And we will also share the video with you so that you can go back and review anything. And then I will also be sending you an email with some fun information. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, Natalie, for joining us. It has been a pleasure listening to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the good questions. And I see a question: is it okay to share portions with my grade level? I think if you mean portions of this recording, that's fine with me. So yeah, spread the word as much as you can. And thanks again, Amy, and everybody else.
It's wonderful. Bye-bye. Thank you. Y'all have a good day.